Welcome to Dr. Karl Grodd, a show where we explore what makes the secular sacred. I'm one of your hosts, Jameson. Consider me your resident enthusiast. And I'm joined by Professor Elbow Patches himself, the soon-to-be Dr. Ben Burnside.
I thought you were going to let me introduce myself.
Well, I did let you think that. That's what happened. So, let's start over. Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Ben Burnside.
And are you going to England to get your PhD?
Yes.
Well, there you go. So the introduction was valid. Welcome to our podcast. Now, I would like to say that this is the first episode, but it's really not. Much like a comic book, this is our new #1 issue, which makes the first...
A reboot.
Yeah, the reboot, if you will. So it makes the first several episodes rarer, more valuable. So if you can track those down, know that you have a living piece of history. Now, we've been on a hiatus for a couple years, but we are excited to be back, to have a more regular schedule, and to talk about kind of, I think, a more streamlined show. I was accused at some instances of going on rants and tirades over nerdy things. Would you say that's accurate?
I think that you might be priming yourself for a rant right now, actually.
Well, I want to show self-control to just change the subject back to what our topic is today. We wanted to spend our reboot episode, our new #1, if you're collecting the issues at home. Make sure you have a good comic book box somewhere in your closet, to talk about who is Dr. Karl Grodd, and to really reflect on what's the purpose and nature of this show, and why, if you're at home, would you be someone who would want to watch. However, having introduced that, how about we do something completely different?
Okay.
This is a segment we were going to do at the beginning of every episode where Burnside and I would prepare a random question and ask it of the other person, so you get to hear a response live on camera. But today we wanted to just ask ourselves, what first interested you into kind of the greater nerddom, if you will? If you look back at your childhood, what were some of those things where you said, I am a nerd and I'm proud of it? And Ben, because I'm minding my manners, I'd love for you to go first.
Yeah, so I proposed the concept of doing a nerdy autobiography, since that's something that never makes it into the autobiographies we give to our churches or other people. This is, I don't know if it'd be a confessional or not, but for me, what really drew me into the hobbies that I'm in was probably when I first got a Super Nintendo as a kid. And I got drawn into our JRPGs, role-playing games. And so, you know, everyone had a Super Nintendo back then. It wasn't nerdy because everyone had one, really, unless you had a, Genesis and you were the one weird kid on the street. But everyone had one, but I got into the longer games, the games that were more obscure, like Chrono Trigger, still one of my favorite games. But what really drew me in was, that whole playing role-playing games or reading lots of books like I did, or watching, cartoon shows on Nickelodeon. They all drew me in and had this kind of like story type element. I think we all get involved in a story. And the older I've gotten, the less I've seen, nerdy hobbies as something that's weird. I think everyone involves himself into whether it's an obsession or a way to frame your life. Everyone has one. It's just when we were kids, it was like if you were okay with saying, yeah, I love reading comic books because I like reading stories, and that made you weird. But nowadays, I'm old enough and mature enough to see, like, we're no different than someone who talks about golf all the time.
Mm-hmm. Different hobbies, different strokes for different folks, you could even say.
So as openly admitting that you play board games that are made for adults, not in the adult sense, but they're made for people who are of adult age. I don't know how to say that appropriately. It's not as weird anymore.
This is going smashingly on our first episode, by the way. Keep going. So you come here to talk about your fetish for adult games.
No. Yeah, so just being involved in deep narratives that spoke to me, because, sports really didn't speak to me that much. I really wasn't one for watching those kinds of things, or even like action movies and lots of other things. I was drawn to the more comic books, more video games, more Japanese presentation of things on Nintendo. So that's what drew me in.
Awesome. And you've hit a little bit on what we'll get to later, which is that I think all of us, if we have hobbies, are drawn to the stories they provide.
Yeah.
And so when I reflect back on what first drew me into nerddom, I mean, there's one iconic show that stands out, and that's Batman, the animated series, which began in 1994. For my generation, our generation, I can't think of another cartoon that kind of did what it did, which was to take kind of those fantasy characters, those characters you saw in the comics, and give them actual real stories, plots. You know, still Heart of Ice, which is an episode about Mr. Freeze, is still one of my favorite cartoon episodes of all time. And it was so interesting to me at the ripe old age of 8. And it's hard to believe that Batman the Animated Series is now old enough to have graduated grad school. So congratulations to the animated series. But I still look back and that showed me, oh, wow, comic books and these hobbies can show me emotionally effective stories.
Yeah.
And really allow me to engage with my mind. And I will say I have always been someone that is very cerebral, that lives in my head. And the idea and concept of Batman, he really was just the mirror image of me as a child. I think handsome, wealthy, no. But there was something about, I thought it was so cool. Here was a man who cared so deeply about his convictions. He would train himself to the fullest extent and just help people. It also didn't hurt that as a young child, watching him punch bad guys in the face was also kind of fun. But from that, kind of went with what you said, is that I was a huge comic book person as a child. It is weird for me when I used to be heckled as a kid, and now it's so mainstream that it's almost like people are over comic books because everyone loves comic books. Let me tell you, from back in the dark ages when not only was it not okay to like comic books, but the 90s for comic book writing was not awesome. I didn't think it was great back then, but having read comic books over the last 30 years, let's just say it was rough.
Comic book stores were all in like warehouses that smelled terrible.
Oh my gosh. I mean, there's a reason that the comic book guy on The Simpsons was so popular.
Yeah,
because,
accurate.
Anyway, so I also was into video games. You know, I grew up playing video games with one of my good friends, Brad, down the street. I still remember getting the absolute mess whooped out of me in Street Fighter Third Strike when I was a Street Fighter kid growing up. And that opened up into other kind of RPGs, as you said, just opportunities. And the one thing that maybe is worth mentioning, in case you're not familiar with RPGs, they're role-playing games, but the reason they're kind of addictive is you get to see a character grow. You get to choose what skills they have. You get to kind of mold them as you want.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of us who have hobbies, we like seeing something start in one place and end in another. And that itself is a narrative, you know?
Yeah.
I think about growing up, we had a neighbor that was really into gardening, but the way he talked about his gardening was no different. It was, I want to take this from a patch of grass, you know, I need to mulch it, and then in a couple months, it's got beautiful roses and flowers. That tells a different kind of story, perhaps, but it's still a narrative.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how we got into this. We have a podcast because we're able to record, and we think at least our family will listen. So they're obligated to listen. So
high aspirations.
We have aspirations, yeah. But I hope that whatever you bring, you find kindred spirits in us. It's worth mentioning probably from the start that we're both ministers. So as we talk about narratives and stories, we have a certain perspective, obviously the Christian perspective that we bring, but we also recognize, and this is kind of where the tagline comes from, what makes the secular sacred, that we're all bound together by stories. And I have many friends that are differing levels of religious, and yet these hobbies have often been a fertile place for our conversation to engage. So with that, and welcoming you in, let's just jump right into kind of our deep dive segment where we want to talk about who is the aforementioned Dr. Karl Grodd. By the way, I love that name. There's a little contentiousness in our team.
I think it's your attempt to make it as obscure as possible of a name.
But I was hoping it would be kind of chic obscure. Like
chic obscure?
Well, you know, like that one club or restaurant, you kind of can't remember the name, but if you do remember, then you know that you're in.
Yeah, yeah. I think of it more like on Mean Girls when she's trying to make fetch happen.
That is an incredibly hurtful and accurate reference. All right. I've been Mean Girl today. That's something that just occurred.
Still a good movie.
So we were talking about Dr. Karl Grodd, and you may have noticed the graphic in the intro that at first seems like the side profile of Sherlock Holmes, very famous kind of profile of Sherlock Holmes. He's got the deer stalker, he's got the pipe. But if you look a little bit more closely at the image, don't rewind now. This is like telling you to turn off the podcast. At a later date, if you want to go back and look at the image, you'll notice the face looks a little different. And that's because we have substituted in a gorilla.
A gorilla?
And you're thinking,
why a gorilla?
Why a gorilla? Those are all worthwhile questions.
And we're not going to answer any of those questions.
Just like Lost, we're going to leave you to the last season with nothing satisfying. Sorry, is it too soon and too obscure? I don't think that's too obscure.
No, it was the most popular show in America, and I'm still upset about it.
I just never got on the Lost bandwagon, and I still hold candlelit vigils for all you fans out there that got to that last season and thought those writers had any idea what they were doing. So,
hey, what does it mean, Jameson?
Well, I think it just means they were in purgatory the whole time.
No, not Lost. I'm trying to get you back on track. Good Lord.
I just thought you were lamenting still about Lost. So, Dr. Karl Grodd, we're going to break it up in two parts. So, the doctor is kind of an affectionate title we put on the front, but the two names are the things that are more kind of important. So, I'll go first to talk about Grodd. Karl may not seem as obscure, but I think that once Burnside explains his bit on that, he's the theological expert. I'm just here to reference the moldy comic book boxes I have. But there is a famous DC comic book villain called Gorilla Grodd. He appears for the first time in Flash, I think, number 106. It's actually a bummer. I collect vintage comic books, and it's not the best comic to collect because it was back in the day when they used to introduce multiple villains per issue. So like the Pied Piper is on that cover. And I'm like, you are introducing Gorilla Grodd, who I think he's up into, for most lists, he's like almost in the top 50 of best comic book villains of all time.
And Pied Piper's number 1, so.
Oh my gosh, yes. If you haven't read Flash 106 for Pied Piper, then why are you even reading comics? I said we wouldn't digress. The point is, he was a incredibly intelligent gorilla that had advanced mental capabilities. In fact, he had mind control and different kinds of telepathy. And I will say, if you've never read comics, you need to realize comic books are a little bit like, I love this from Pirates of the Caribbean, their continuity are more like guidelines. So what characters can and can't do, it kind of depends on what the writer wants to do. But so Gorilla Grodd has always been super intelligent. He comes from a place called Gorilla City, which are these incredibly advanced, almost it's like George of the Jungle meets the Jetsons.
Yeah.
That's how I think of it. I mean, that kind of city, but they're all gorillas. And his desire is to use his great intellect and mind control abilities to take over the planet. I mean, classic villain.
Is that close to Gorillapolis?
Wow. That is a great question that we won't answer. So that's kind of the background on that. We wanted to pick someone who kind of represented someone who was sophisticated, intelligent, and nerdy. And you can't get much nerdier than I think Gorilla Grodd. But tell us a little bit more about the Karl, because I think that guy's at least human.
Well, and the doctor's not affectionate. This part of it is Dr. Karl Barth. So it's Dr. Karl and Grodd.
Right. I was just saying it was affectionate for Grodd. That was my piece. He's not actually a doctor. I mean, he's probably smart enough he probably has an honorary doctorate degree. Do they give out honorary doctorates to supervillains? I don't know. It's a great question.
Karl Barth was a Swiss Reformed theologian who did the bulk of his writings after World War I, starting in the 1920s. He was a prolific person, but to really understand his approach, you need to know who he's really responding to. He was trained by a lot of liberal theologians, most significantly von Harnack, who really looked at Christianity as there is a truth contained within it, a kernel, and there's a lot of things that have come up around Christianity that he would call a husk. So we need to shed all of this bulk and get down to it. So people at this time were looking at the Bible as a historical textbook, saying how to get rid of all the mythology that's in here. How do we get rid of, some people were really uncomfortable with the concept of miracles. So they said, well, miracles can't scientifically happen, but we still think that Jesus is the Son of God and had great teaching. So how do we strip away this mysticism? How do we strip away Greek philosophy, for example, from the 2,000-year development of theology? And Karl Barth was, his entire career and the movement he started was a reaction against this kind of liberal theology, and said, no, the only way that we can truly speak about God is by honoring Scripture, really, and as the Word of God. So the previous approach was to start with what we know, what we can observe, and almost like a scientific thing, and try to build up to an understanding of God. And Karl Barth was to say we should take what we have received from God, which is revelation. And so we're going to start up here with the revealed Word of God. And what we're going to learn about ourselves will be learned from the revelation. So a top-down kind of model. And so he really came to it with a really scriptural approach. And because of that, he wrote a ton about a lot of different topics. There wasn't like one central argument I can clearly say to you. But he's a very foundational theologian for me. And not only that he had a lot of great ideas, but also kind of created this new movement of theology, which continues to this day. I think, Jameson and I both went to Duke, and I think Karl Barth was mentioned in almost every class. So whether you've read him or not,
he's part of the killer bees. If we can use a little Houston Astros language there, but if you're talking about two very defining theologians that came out of von Harnack's school of thought, I mean, you can't go wrong with Dietrich Bonhoeffer or Karl Barth. I mean, those are kind of one was kind of the more pragmatic theologian, and then Karl Barth, like you said, wrote more volumes of work than you think one man would, outside of Alexander Hamilton, according to the musical, apparently, but copious, prolific, I think is the word you use. That's a good way to put it.
So one example of his insights is there's long time a debate about predestination. And some people said predestination is true. Other people said predestination is false. This kind of idea that people had been labeled by God from the beginning of time as either saved or damned. Can I say damned on the podcast?
I think because it's a religious context, we'll allow it. But
okay.
If you could be mindful between that and the adult bookstores, whatever you were talking about earlier. So,
okay. Anyway, it was either to accept or deny it. His scripture, I mean, he was a Reformed position, but he still said, Scripture says that we have been predestined. So what do we do with that if it is true? And it was him who came up with the insight that says that is Jesus who is the one who's predestined, and through him we have been chosen to have the capability of participating with Christ. So that it's not each person because if everyone was determined, then the work of Jesus wouldn't matter. If people from the beginning of time were determined as saved or not from the beginning of time, then Jesus didn't need to die. So it's just this kind of flipping of the insight of saying that Jesus is the one who is predestined. And I can talk forever about that, but just to give you a sense of who he is.
Right. And so coming back from Burnside's PhD studies, no, that's actually really helpful. The reason we have, I think, Karl Barth in the name as well is we want to recognize from the beginning that we all have really significant worldviews that inform us. I mean,
yes.
We could talk about, and this is kind of the purpose of the day, is the power of stories and narrative. But for most of us, we bring something to stories, and that's why we resonate with them. Mm-hmm. We're not necessarily blank slates. We don't show up to something with no kind of cultural or family or whatever has been poured into you. That's what resonates with that story. Now, you can learn something new. But what we appreciate about Karl Barth, at least from our perspective, is that he acknowledged that if we're Christian, we just need to be upfront with what is driving our exploration, not the other way around.
Right.
And I would argue for most of us, I'm comfortable saying this even about science. I think with the scientific method, even scientists bring in their own worldview to what will happen in that process. Because I'm totally in the camp that I believe the scientific method is neutral. It is a way to test hypothesis. I mean, it's right. No different than a doctor hitting me in the knee to test my reflexes. Like there's not intent, but they still bring this worldview that we are going to build from the bottom up. Whereas Absolutely. We might say we're coming from the top down. And what I love about this podcast and what I hope that we're able to do is to acknowledge how we approach literally this table. And I hope that you see what we have. We have one of my favorite board games, Cowboy Bebop, which is weird to me. It's almost mainstream now how popular it's become, but one of the most defining animes I've ever watched. And one of my favorite mangas, which is just a fancy way of saying Japanese comic book, in Akira. But all of these have stories that will resonate with us, even if we bring different worldviews. And I think that's what we want to do on this podcast is to acknowledge how we can share in stories because if they're powerful and we can agree on this and have good conversation over this and share ideas, and this can be a way that I want to be careful and not just talk about like evangelizing to give it too strong of a theological connotation, but more about we can be normal people together. I mean, they don't test you at the door of every movie to say, what is your religious persuasion before we let you in to watch this? But it would be interesting to say, depending on what religious persuasion or non-religious or wherever you come from, how do you approach this movie? What has influenced you and what do you take from it? You know, why do certain stories have more meaning than others to certain groups of people? That's kind of a fascinating
So one of the approaches we want to bring, I think, is looking at these things not just as a sense of enjoyment, but actually paying attention to those markers of story. What is the implicit assumptions, philosophy, morality that lie behind what we're doing, right? And a lot of them are specifically engineered to make you ask those kinds of questions. You can't watch Batman without wondering about vigilante justice and is that good or bad? And in many senses, it's meant to evoke those emotions, but sometimes we don't add that layer. And so in preaching, one of the main things that I look at it as is realizing everyone makes decisions and lives their lives primarily because of the stories that are ingrained in them.
Yes.
It's not just an abstract philosophy that you read and you say, I'm going to live my life by this, but it's a story. And so we have the option of if we can step away from ourselves, of choosing a story that we can live by. And if we don't reflect on our own life, we'll live by whatever story has been given to us. Maybe something we picked up that maybe isn't good for us, we haven't looked at it. And so getting into the story of God is something that you live, is that kind of choice that you make to say, I'm participating in this. And so I can play King of Tokyo.
It's a great game, by the way. You should check it out.
I can play King.
So if you don't know what King of Tokyo is, essentially imagine Yahtzee meets Godzilla, and if that excites you at all, you should pick it up. But
yeah, I mean, I guess there's not very many examples of how Space Penguin is acting in a moral manner, but I can approach that as being part of the story that I've created and bring my own insights.
By the way,
Yellow,
the board
I'm sorry,
game
is this in front of me?
Is not sponsoring us yet. However, Yellow, if you're hearing this, we love King of Tokyo. They're the board game producer. Yeah, and I want to be careful too, because I think some people may hear story and think what we're saying is make-believe. I think, and we need to be careful. Story, sacred truth, sacred myth, sacred story, what it indicates is it's your experience of a deeper reality. And so if we say it's our story or the story of God, what we mean is we think there is a reality that we're experiencing, and to the best of our ability, that's what this story is. Now, we're also clear, because I think the Bible is clear on this as well, that our perception is not always reality. And so that's where some of that reflection has to come. Even if you think you're coming at it the right way, there needs to be the humility. And I love what Neil deGrasse Tyson says, the famous astrophysicist, when he says, if you're on the cutting edge of science, you need to have humility because you're literally exploring the verge of what you know and what you don't know. And I think for a lot of us, when we're growing, we need to recognize we're on the cutting edge of who we are between what we know and what we don't know. That doesn't mean that those are some core principles that don't matter or are true, but you need to be humble enough to, if you're trying to grow, then you may not know something or something may have to change. And what we hope on this podcast is that we kind of talk and discuss and grow and change together. And to be upfront, like I said, about where we come from, but as we hopefully hear from you and able to engage with you, we'd love to hear where you come from, your decisions. I mean, I would love to have a conversation on why does Batman the Animated Series speak to you? Yeah. And now may be good, Burnside. We've been talking a lot about the title, giving you a broad sweep of what we want Dr. Karl Grodd to be. And I know, like anyone else, maybe some specific examples of some stories or narratives that have been kind of impactful to us. We talked a little bit about what drew us into the hobby, but now we can talk about some defining narratives that we've really reflected on. And for me, because I'm still running and talking here, so I'm going to go ahead and just take the lead. I didn't let you go first last time, so one of the most defining TV shows of all time for me is The Twilight Zone. If Batman the Animated Series drew me in as a kid, The Twilight Zone is what really was a TV show that engaged my mind and really wrestled with in creative ways conversations on censorship and isolation, and what makes real relationship, what builds upon community. The fact that it came out in 1959 sometimes, and yet it's, or I want to say Orwellian, think 1984 Animal Farm, but its lens, I mean, what Rod Serling was able to do with little 20-minute vignettes is incredible to me. And at that point, I'd never watched a show where every episode I walked away and I had kind of a cool story, and then I had kind of a deeper truth I had to reflect on. One of my favorite episodes is actually in my office. It's called The Eye of the Beholder. But, from the classic saying, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. I have a hard time talking about this episode because it almost ruins it if I name it. But essentially, it's a society in which there's a distortion of what is considered beautiful. And this whole episode, you're thinking that this woman is disfigured by normal standards, and at the end you realize the tables are really flipped, and what is beautiful is only because there's a certain group of people in power, and it kind of blew my mind as a kid. I just have a distinct memory of watching that, and I left and I was like, is the world real? What is real? But what was so cool about that is that was challenging narratives that I had from my faith or my family or my community, and I had to reflect on, well, then how do I treat other people? Mm-hmm. How do I view them? But that's a TV show doing that. Yeah, I think that episode came out in 1960. So that's, if I watched that, and I think I really watched most of the Twilight Zone when I was in high school, so 2000. That's 40-year gap between a black and white television show that aired on CBS and when I watched it on reruns. I can't even remember where. That's the power of stories, is they kind of transcend time. So maybe what's one that has spoken to you?
I just wanted to say from earlier, story does not mean something that's fictional.
That's a good clarification again.
So thank you for that. It means that we have a collected experience by which we process and understand our lives. So answering the question, one of the biggest narratives, I think of my formative years, like when I was a child, I wasn't watching Twilight Zone. I've seen it as an adult, but it doesn't have that kind of formative. So, I mean, for me, it's Star Wars. I think that's an obvious example for most of us. But that was my first time to ever see a trilogy, an epic of following characters. George Lucas very much modeled it after the hero's journey. So in many ways, it is one of the most generic stories, but it was done in a way that definitely drew me in. And as I've grown up, I've seen all his influences and how he was using all these different parts of old cinema and different genres of cinema, really. But for me, it was foundational in the sense of, creating this good versus bad, this light Jedi duty kind of service versus this empire. And so it was basic enough, but also drew me in to kind of do this kind of thinking. And science fiction, for me, has always done the same thing that you're talking about. It asks those questions. It asks about morality and all those sorts of things. So for me, Star Trek, watching that was the point where I was like, they were wrestling with the Prime Directive and how do we do this? So I personally love Star Trek because I just stood around and talked.
So you're publicly confessing to liking Star Trek? This is recorded,
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's cool now. Is it?
Sure, keep going.
Oh, okay.
I'm not trying to break your stride.
But the point of the Star Trek was to raise issues, to say, okay, well, we could scientifically help them, but they don't believe in science, and we don't want to violate their religious views. So where does that interaction happen? Just all those sorts of conversations is what science fiction really provides. In many ways, it portrays a future that's just disconnected from us enough where we can think about these issues of deep morality and stuff as not being really connected in our lives, where we have these like automatic opinions.
That's a good point. And I'm teasing a little bit about him being a Trekkie.
I love Star Trek. I don't care.
Yeah. He actually has the Klingon translation of the Bible, so you have to ask him to read it to you sometime. But the best part of that show is the Prime Directive. The idea that what a powerful conversation point, and we'll probably not talk about too much because I can imagine this will be a podcast episode, but what allows us to filter out if you can help, but should you help? I mean, that's really what Star Trek is all about to me. You come across civilizations that are not nearly as advanced as the Federation, and then how do you engage with them? And it is a very good show. Well, I shouldn't say that. there are certain Star Trek shows that are good, is the way that I will say that. I'm trying not to go on a rant. I also think it's interesting you bring up Star Wars, because it's almost Star Fantasy. I think about this a lot too, and this is really splitting hairs, but even that is not it's not normal sci-fi as I think about sci-fi. It's kind of, if there's a spectrum of Star Trek on one end and Lord of the Rings,
absolutely.
Lord of the Rings on the other, I think you put Star Wars towards the middle and it leans towards Lord of the Rings. Like it's a typical fantasy hero's journey epic, but set in space.
Yeah, it could be a Western.
Right. And actually,
could be anything.
We'll try to drop in little nerd tidbits for you, but I mean, Star Wars is based off of the work of, I can't call him underappreciated, but maybe people don't know him as well as they should, which is Akira Kurosawa.
Yeah.
I mean, what he did with Samurai not only influenced the next one I wanted to bring up, which is The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, one of the most formative movies I watched as a kid. Also, probably arguably the best Western ever made. But that was even based on Kurosawa's work, who did what Star Wars did. I think Star Wars is based off of his movie Hidden Fortress. It's not based off of it, but
sure. The structure of having two characters, like the place that the droids play, right, like the screen wipes. I mean, if you watch it, you'll see a lot of similarities.
That's fair. What I mean is, it's interesting that here is when people think about American cinema, Star Wars is quintessential American cinema, and yet you think about Hidden Fortress, it is so Japanese, and yet it's still a powerful story that speaks, but it's obviously been translated through Samurai, the same way that Westerns were translated into American. So that again is the power of that story that can drift. Like the hero's journey, I like what you said, is almost an archetype of sorts, and yet different communities pick up on it and they imprint what is culturally relevant to them. Mm-hmm. And that's really cool. We've talked a lot today, and so I'll just say briefly about The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. It was a Western, when I watched it, that really brought up, I think, morality and ethics for the first time. It's I don't know, there's something about it. I watched it for the first time, I think, in junior high, and I just remember leaving and thinking, were there good guys in this? I know that's... I know Batman could be seen as an anti-hero, but overall, I mean, he's still Batman, so you kind of give him the hero. But I remember watching The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and I got done, and I just had never watched a film that had that kind of moral ambiguity. Yeah. I mean, Blondie, who's Clint Eastwood's character, the man with no name, one of my favorite. However you collect those movies together, his archetype character in that, I love the Man with No Name series. I know that there's technically a series, but there's some that kind of extend beyond it. And literally all that means is he's literally just a character that doesn't really have a real name. I mean, they call him a nickname the whole time.
The Man with No Name. Yeah.
Well, they don't call him that. They call him Blondie. But my point is, in that movie. But I'm sorry, I'm catching myself from going on a rant. But I remember leaving and asking my parents, like, what does that mean? And they're like, well, sometimes, you won't always have the kind of black and white that you want, Jameson. There's going to be gray, and people just have to make the best decisions. But when I was 12, that blew my mind. Yeah. Because I just thought, wait, the Westerns, you got to have the one really good guy, the sheriff character.
The Duke.
And at the time, I understood maybe the sheriff character, his marriage fell down and he was drinking, but he would come, John Wayne would come back and sober up. But I'd never watched a whole film where by the end, you're like, was anyone good? Yeah. Not to mention the score in that movie. Holy mother. That was the first time I ever listened to a soundtrack and wanted to buy it. I actually remember trying to get it on CD so I could listen to it, because just the scoundrel. If you have not listened to, the composer's name is leaving me at the moment. He just passed away, and I cannot think of it, and that's terrible. But the point is, if you listen to the soundtrack for that, it shows you, and we talk about music at a different point, the power of music and how it can instill feelings in a scene. As we draw up this section, I want to give you a shout out, Burnside, if you had another example you wanted to share, maybe of a narrative or story that shaped you. Star Wars and Star Trek are great, and so I just wanted to even it out by doing 2 and 2. But if you want to get the win here,
I'll just pick up right where you left off about moral ambiguity. That kind of feeling is like whenever you watch like a gangster movie or like Sopranos, is just that realization where no one in this is good.
Yeah, by the classic definition of good, these are not the people I'm bringing over to meet grandma necessarily.
Right, but there are stretches of the Old Testament where it's very much like that. It's like, who's doing the least bad right now?
The book of Judges is a little grim.
Yeah, it's a little grim. And, it really points to the fact that you can really love like a specific action or characteristic of a person, but they may not always live up to your expectations, which, it's that kind of perspective helps you like live life in general, and something like Superman's a lot more idealistic. We look forward to...
I'm not taking the Superman bait.
We look forward to exploring all sorts of things like this, narratives and structure, and getting more into the nitty-gritty of things as we go forward, for sure.
And we won't often do this in a podcast, but definitely because this is our intro one, we'll say what we want to do in every deep dive is to tackle either a story with examples or maybe why, so for instance, it'd be the difference between if we want to talk about The Last Jedi, which we're planning to talk about in our next podcast. There's two ways to tackle it, I think. Either we talk about The Last Jedi and what are the stories that come out of it, or we talk about a kind of story that The Last Jedi represents. And so either way, what we're really exploring is how does this medium, these hobbies we love, video games, music, anime, board games, whatever else we want to throw in, comic books, how do those stories interact with us, and how do we interact with them? What do we take from them? What can we leave with them? And then how do they challenge us?
Yeah.
And then, ultimately, I think there will be always some spiritual reflection on our part, because that is undeniably, I always tell people, if you ask me my favorite hobbies, God's an understood. But the reason I say that kind of tongue-in-cheek is that I know that influences me, and I can't turn that off. But at the same time, I think it's important for all of us to maybe start to identify what are those things in us that's hard for us to turn off, because that influences a lot of how we perceive things. We also want to end every show with what I'm calling 90-second Nostradamus. I may never say that again. In fact, saying it out loud, it sounds terrible.
Yeah.
But the idea is, it'll be in the script notes for the show. But we want to do one thing we're excited about that's coming up over the next couple weeks. What's one thing we're looking ahead to? We want to give a shout out to it, and just to show off our nerddom, because this is a place in which we can be excited about nerdy things and receive less judgment than we typically would by our regular set of family and friends. So what's something coming up in the next couple weeks you're really excited about?
First of all, once I hit 30, I stopped feeling judgment for being nerdy. I don't know if that ever happened to you, but I've shed it.
Wow.
Yeah, I've shed it. I'm very proud.
Send me the name of the retreat center you went to. I'll try, but...
Yeah, this is super nerdy, but I'm looking forward to the new edition of Warhammer 40K.
Oh, yeah. When is that coming out?
It should be out within the next month or so. It's kind of a complicated story. Basically, they sold it in a box, and it sold out immediately, and it goes on from there. But yes, there's a new rule set coming out, which means new models and new miniatures. I paint Space Marines, and I want to buy more Space Marines. I'll buy any Space Marines they're willing to sell me, so I'm just waiting for them to make more so I can paint them.
One thing we always try to do, and I'll do it here for him on his behalf, is we'll always try to explain part of our nerddom. So if you don't know what Warhammer 40K is, I'm doing this because Burnside will have to help out a little bit more for me than I will for him. No, I'll explain it. I'll explain it for you. 40K is because I think it's interesting to see if I know it as well as I should.
Go ahead.
So there are something called collectible miniature games, and this is a tabletop battle game. Essentially, think about if your grandfather used to play or do Civil War reenactments with miniatures, but put creatures and genetically engineered men from 40,000 years in the future onto your table. But the idea is you get these models, you get to build them, sand them down, paint them. You get to give them your own artistic design, and there's rules if you can actually fight. I would say the thing that I do appreciate about 40K is it almost feels like it's 50-50 between folks that collect them to paint them as a hobby and those that actually play the game.
Yeah.
But that's the beauty of it, is it doesn't matter. You can do either. And so what Burnside's excited about is that every once in a while, there's probably some deep story reason that they reboot the franchise, right? Not just for money, but also for money. So they're coming out with a new edition, which that's exciting.
New edition, new rules, and new models. Yes, I do enjoy the more modeling, painting side of it all. It is, I'm sure I'll talk about it more, but it's a moment of zen for me to sit down from the day and just zone out and paint for a while.
You've gotten quite good at it. Some of the stuff I've seen you paint lately has been very nice. In fact, I keep trying to slide some of my stuff to his house. Be like, yeah, why don't you work on
into the queue?
Into the queue.
What are you excited about?
So I am super excited about a new board game that's coming out. It's from Leder Games, Leder. If you are familiar with board games at all, you may have heard of one of their more popular titles called Root. It's kind of hit the world by storm. It's kind of like Redwall, if any of us are familiar with that book series, but think kind of Robin Hood meets Forest Creatures. And it's a really interesting tactical game, but they're making a game that's more family friendly. And I say that because Root is fairly complicated for how cute the foxes are. That's what I always tell people. If you see the cats on the box, know it's a lot more complicated. But it's about kids, recruiting kids. You get to collect, your two resources are pizza and toys, and you're trying to build the best fort. But it's a really cool card game that's based a little bit off of Race for the Galaxy, which if you're into board games is a very famous board game, but it involves a lot of building up your own set of friends. When you play cards, other people are allowed to follow your turn, which just means that they can copy what you do. And the artwork looks great, and it's supposed to play in under like 25, 30 minutes. So I'm really big on kind of breezy games. It's on pre-order right now, so if you want to go to Leder Games, you can order it. I think it goes to, this is maybe more information than want. Often, board game distributors will make things available on their site, and then when it goes to mass market, you can go to any of the many wonderful, either local board game stores or online distributors, depending on how you like to get your board games. So I'm really excited about that. It's supposed to ship, I think, the first or second week of August. So,
but they're not supporting us. He just knows all this.
I'm hoping someone from Leder Games is out there being like, that's someone I can get behind. So Fort, F-O-R-T. And I just look at it, it looks awesome. I do want to say one shout out. If you build your fort the quickest, you want to know what the extra mile trophy is for the game? The macaroni sculpture.
Nice.
So I hope to one day proudly display the macaroni sculpture and say that I stole that from Burnside. Well, we really appreciate that you've joined us today. I feel like we've had a really good talk about kind of what this podcast is about, what we're going to be doing in the weeks to come. One of the things we want to do is get consistent with how our podcast operates, and then we probably will eventually branch out into some more shorter specials, maybe in some areas where we'll review music, review movies. Both of us have been into records, at times, and kind of vinyl, if you will. And all of that, we hope, will continue to engage with you as we seek to explore what makes the secular sacred. So once again, my name is Jameson Doring. I'm your resident enthusiast.
Oh, I'm Ben Burnside.
Our resident theologian.
There we go.
And we've had a great time with you. Until next time.